thank you for coming here. I am George Wu. I'm a faculty member here at Chicago Booth, a member of the Center for Decision Research. So in a couple minutes, I will give you a little bit of introduction for our special guest speaker, Steve Wendel from Morningstar. But before I get there, I want to say a little bit about this series and what's coming forward. So this is the fourth in a series which we're calling Think Better. And the idea of this series is to kind of bring behavioral science to you and to help you to understand some of the implications of behavioral science research for improving our lives, improving our decision making, whether that's about policy decision making or corporate decision making and so forth. We run one of these a quarter, so this is the first one for the 2019-20 academic year. There are two that are coming up. Adam Alter is a marketing professor and an author of a few best-selling books on behavioral science, and Alyssa Fishbane is the managing director of Ideas 42, one of the most renowned and respected organizations that uses behavioral science. So let me just say a couple more things, which is that I think, as most of you know, this is just one of many activities that we do at the Center for Decision Research. Our primary activity is to create ideas, to do research. So this is something that I do along with my faculty colleagues, our postdocs, and our graduate students. One of the vehicles that we use to collect research is through our research laboratories. So we run a number of PIMCO decision research laboratories. We run one in Hyde Park, we run one downtown, in addition to a bunch of sort of pop-up things at Museum of Science, Second City, and I hope some of you participated in the one today. And that actually brings me to the last announcement, which is that I'm really delighted to tell you about something new that we're doing. We're in the process of constructing, what do we call it, a Behavioral Science Discovery Center. So this is the first thing of this kind. It will be located on Michigan Ave, right across from the Art Institute. So this is going to be really exciting. We'll do it to do the same kind of things that we do in the research labs, which is to run experiments and conduct research. But in addition to that, we're going to use it as a way of telling people about the ideas of behavioral science. So there'll be exhibits, multimedia, lots of interesting things like that. So this will open sometimes in 2020. Don't ask me for a more precise date, but we'll keep you all informed. Okay, so with that as an introduction, let me introduce our special guest and friend, Steve Wendel from Morningstar. As you know, Morningstar is a great partner and friend of Chicago Booth, almost, I guess, literally from the beginning. Steve is the head of the behavioral science group at Morningstar. He'll tell you a little bit about the activities. Unlike a lot of people in the Morningstar, he comes from a slightly different background. He has a PhD from the University of Maryland, where he studied behavioral change, and one of the experts in terms of understanding this. One of my favorite parts of his bio, which I can resonate with him, is that he said he has two kids, neither of which are interested in behavioral science. So that's true of my kids. Maybe we can talk about behavioral change, or maybe we can just give up. But anyway, so really pleased to welcome Steve. Just one thing is that Steve will talk into about 6:45, and then we'll open it up for about 15 minutes of questions. So let's welcome our special guest, Steve Wendel.
Hey everybody, good to see you all today. As George mentioned, I head the behavioral science team at Morningstar. I've been working in the private sector as a behavioral scientist for about 10 years now, 5 with Morningstar and 5 with a previous company, and the field has grown immensely. Previously, it was very difficult to find basically anybody who was doing serious work in the private sector 10 years ago. And that has changed. And it's changed in large part due to, well, groups like the CDR, researchers like Richard Thaler and Danny Kahneman. And I thought I'd start just by taking one quick check Who here would benefit from a basic introduction to behavioral science before we dive in? Okay, there we go. So it took about a 3-second delay, and then after the first person, suddenly a lot of hands went up. Okay, no problem. So let me give you a bit of background of what behavioral science is. And I like to use an example, which is, do you have a friend, because it's never, of course, ourselves, do you have a friend who, well, would probably benefit from going to the gym more often and exercising, not because they're necessarily out of shape, but because long-term that's the right thing to do and it's probably going to be good for them, right? Almost all of us do. Do you have a friend who, in fact, has a gym membership or has one of those snazzy home gym exercise sets that they just never use? We all do. So behavioral science studies those two problems in particular. Problems of decision. When something seems rational and seems thoughtful for someone to do, it's in their interest, they might even enjoy it, but they don't actually make that choice. Either they avoid it or they make a different choice. And then, where I have spent most of my research career, is the second problem, the having a gym membership but not going to it, we call the intention-action gap. Why do people say that they want to do something, sincerely believe it, are truly motivated for it, and then it never happens? Why does that happen? And so around these two problems, you can think of behavioral science as, it is a tremendously diverse field, but I like to summarize it in terms of it's an understanding of the mind, of why we have these types of decisions, why we have the interaction gap. Second, it is a set of tools that researchers have developed to help address the quirks of the mind, of our decision-making and our action. And third, it is what I call a structured humility, a belief that we are almost always wrong. And then if we test in the field, especially through rigorous randomized control trials, we can become slightly less wrong over time. Does that make sense? As behavioral science, we have a body of literature about the quirks of the mind. That's what gets the most attention. That's what most people see. That's the part of nudge that they focus on, right? Or of thinking fast and slow, et cetera. They see all these funny things that the mind does. But we are interventionists. We are looking to help people do better in their lives. That's the second part. But we know that we don't do it well. That it's just a hard thing to do. And so that's the third part, experimental work, to test whether we're right. And so that's behavioral science in a nutshell. And there is such amazing promise in our field. And we've seen examples over the last 10 years of everything from helping people save for the future, defaults, very well-known example, to helping people who have been victims of domestic violence in New South Wales, to helping support local governments by bringing in taxes when people procrastinate, to helping people exercise, to helping people simply spend more time with their families. There's just such a wealth of great examples of products and services in the private sector that do these things. But at the same time, there is also a whole lot of real challenges facing us. And that's what I want to talk about today. The opportunities and the challenges that we can see in the private sector. And actually, I'll bundle together both the private sector and nonprofits, because as you'll see, there are often quite a lot of similarities there. So I'll share some from my personal experience. I also ran a survey recently that we believe is the largest survey of behavioral teams around the world. I haven't found any others who have done this. And so the knowledge, this understanding of the field is imperfect. It is incomplete, but I hope that it will be useful. And so please feel free to ask questions. Also, this is the first time that I'll be presenting results from the survey, that any of us involved in it have been presenting results in the survey. So I really welcome your feedback and your thoughts as well. Deal? I speak, you speak. Got it? Yeah. Cool. All right. So, at some point, it'd be great to have some slides. Hey, there's some slides. Okay. So where did this come from? So this came from, I wrote a book 6 years ago. First one is called Designing for Behavior Change. It's a manual for private companies and nonprofits to apply behavioral science in their work. My publisher asked me to rewrite, to do a second edition of it recently, and I started interviewing people in the field, right? Calling up friends, calling up other companies, and saying, hey, I want to talk to you. And I quickly realized that was going to take a whole lot of time. Lordy! There are just so many different groups out there. I decided, okay, let me partner with a couple of different groups and build a survey that can get a better sense than just individual interviews can. The survey is called Behavioral Teams. It was developed in partnership with the Behavioral Science Policy Association. I know a number of folks from Chicago Booth are involved with it, as well as the Action Design Network, which is a nonprofit I started about 7 years ago that helps train people and educate people about applied behavioral science. So to cut to the chase, the 4 key lessons that we have from this is the point at which, right after the slide you can leave or have some more meatballs, whatever you like. Just to give you the skinny here, is that the field is tremendously diverse, radically different than it was 10 years ago, even 5 years ago. We see a tremendous growth since 2013 in particular, and I'll show you the dates of what's happened. Second, we see that while the problems that people are working on differ from company to company, the process is remarkably similar, and I'll explain what that is, which is really a blueprint for doing this yourself. There are, often people ask, okay, how do you get into this field? There are quite a lot of job opportunities, but they're not what you think. They're not with behavioral teams. Sorry. And I'll show you what it means. I'll show you really where they are. And the challenges are real, and they come down to practical challenges of working within a company. But more importantly, and where we'll spend most of the time, is on the ethical challenges. Because it's quite possible, just to get your attention, that this field will be legislated away. Okay? And we will get to that if we do not understand both the opportunity and the real risks that we face in the field. There we go, that's doing something now. So there are many definitions of what behavioral science is. I won't argue them, I'll instead just tell you the definition we used for the survey. We asked people whether they were intentionally designing products and services to change someone's behavior. Second, that they were drawing on the empirical literature that I mentioned, the specific literature from Richard Thaler, Gerd Gigerenzer, Dan Ariely, Wendy Wood, et cetera. This body of related work, all drawing from an experimental base and this understanding of the mind that I was talking about, of judgments and of intention action. And then for many people, behavioral science requires experiments. I wanted to see whether people who called themselves doing behavioral science were running experiments or not. So we left that out as an optional. And quite a lot of people actually started the survey, saw this and said, no, that's not us. And we are sending them a report anyway. So I'll talk about those. So just to make sure there was no incentive to lie or give false statements about their team. Okay, and so that's our definition. We can talk about some of the critiques in the field a little bit later, but that's what we're working with. Now we sent out this survey, basically an open call, because there is no just directory of teams out there in the world. There's no such thing. So we did an open call through social media, through the Behavioral Science Policy Association, through the Action Design Network, et cetera. We got over 200 distinct teams who responded. Now, 200, is that good? Is that bad? It seems like a lot, but you don't really know. I certainly don't know. Until you say, what is the overall universe? Now, again, there's no directory, but we can start to triangulate how big the field is by taking all the dang sources out there, so, and combining them into one list. And what we find by combining, for example, Ingrid Paulin at Rally Health has been crowdsourcing a list for the last few years. She has about 230 on hers. Faisal Nehru at OECD has kept a list. He's got about 200 on his. There are job boards in the field. You draw from all of those, and you do a whole lot of Google searching, and you get up to about 473. Now, I can't tell. That's the known universe. I can't tell you what's beyond that known universe, because it's unknown, but I can tell you just that anecdotally, it's gotten really, really hard to find any other teams out there. I think we're about at the edge of that fuzzy universe. Okay? The field is constantly expanding, but I think we're about there right now. And so what are these teams? Well, we still have the bulk in the US. I think it's about 43% in the US. We've got about 15% in the UK, 6% in the Netherlands, same in Australia, and then just about everywhere else. Armenia, Portugal, a cluster in South Africa, all over the world. Oh, and by the way, all of these results will be public as well as the master list. Okay, so we'll be sharing all of this as well. Now, the teams, the predominant form of these teams is private sector. Okay, that's one reason to talk about it. There are, of course, some very well-known academic groups, Booth, Harvard, Penn, Warwick, LSE, et cetera. But by and large, it's, the action is in the private companies, and that's where we're going to focus on today. So those are nice numbers. Let me give you some examples of the diversity of the field. So the Busara Center started as an academic research center by folks at Kennedy School at Harvard, located in Nairobi. Actually, Nairobi and some in Western Kenya. And they started out basically as a research shop, helping academics field their studies. They quickly grew from that, and now have 5 offices across the developing world. They do a wide range of projects, primarily for private clients, everything from encouraging competition in the banking sector in Kenya, helping people save through mobile money, helping women who have recently become pregnant have the iron they need in the system to produce breast milk that will help their kids grow. FCA, that's a Financial Conduct Authority of the UK. This is a small team. I think it was around 8 last time I checked. Not sure how many it is now. They look at how can we have people pay more attention to the financial products they have, to the bank accounts, to the investments, et cetera. So they've done a series of studies on disclosure and how you talk about the fees that someone pays, for example, when investing. And they do randomized control trials, they publish these, they do white papers, et cetera. Really serious, great group at the FCA. Here's a private sector example, System 1, previously known as Brain Juicer. Based out of the UK, offices here in the US and around, and they wrote a book called System 1, right? System 1 is the intuitive part of the mind, unlocking profitable growth. And one of the examples they give is how you can apply behavioral science to increase the fluency of your beer brand relative to your competing beers. New Moms is a nonprofit here in Chicago. They recently hired a person named Dana, who is very interested in applying behavioral science, has some background in this, is looking to start running RCTs. What they do is they help young mothers, especially low income, to have the resources they need to help their child. So the education, the nutrition, the support, et cetera. Great group, just started. The organization's been around for a while, but their behavioral side has just started a few months ago. Completely and utterly different. That's the range we're seeing out there. Very, very different application areas. Which makes it all the more interesting that when you look at what they're doing, it's actually fundamentally the same. So let me give an example of this. And I'll use the example of Clover Health, which is a Medicare Advantage provider on the East Coast. And they have a great behavioral team run by Matt Wallert. So they were looking at the problem of poor care for low-income folks. Right? Sadly, through both government data and a lot of anecdotal evidence, we know that often people in poor neighborhoods don't get great medical care. So they want to understand why that was happening. So they had an overall problem, and they want to figure out what they can do about it. So they started thinking out some hypotheses. Oh, maybe it's just a long distance to the doctor. Nope, that's not the case. In fact, it's actually inversely related. The farther you go, the better the doctor you get. Maybe it's because poor neighborhoods don't have good doctors. They have the benefit of having administrative data on quality of doctors, et cetera. And they found actually that's not the case either. So they tried a number of hypotheses to try and figure out what's the real behavioral obstacle? What's going on? And what they found was a history of medical racism. That so many people in lower income neighborhoods, they just gave up. They'd been truly discriminated against. And there simply weren't any good doctors for a long time. And they weren't treated well. They said, well, what's the point? I'm not going to go look for a doctor. This is the best I can get. Now, the habit of not looking around has stayed. The facts on the ground have changed. Now there are, in fact, quite a lot of high-quality doctors in poor neighborhoods. And so the behavioral obstacle that they identified was, well, people aren't searching, which is completely it's not something you'd immediately think of, right? You think it might be income, it might be access, et cetera. No, it's actually something in here, a behavioral obstacle that was stopping at least this population from looking for a high-quality doctor. And so given that behavioral obstacle, what they did was they said, okay, what can we learn from the behavioral literature, from that body of work, and the interventions, the secondary, the interventions that other people have developed to try and overcome this? Well, they knew that because of this history of medical racism, they had to first build trust. They had to acknowledge the problem and say, look, I get it. We know this has happened. We're with you. This is terrible, right? But things have changed. So turning the corner. And they also knew that this is fundamentally it's a hard thing to do for somebody who's never looked for a doctor. So they wanted to remove all the frictions, all what we call the channel factors that stand in the way of somebody going and finding a good doctor. And so they developed, from this understanding of the interventions, the behavioral design, they developed an actual product, in this case communication, that said, we understand this is what's happened in the past, things have changed, and here's the doctor. Here's the map, here's the picture, here's the person. Made it just dirt simple for the person to take action once they had built trust. So that's the intervention. And then they tested in the field, and they had 80% uptake, which is astounding and wonderful. And so when you look at that, you say, okay, that's a particular case. In fact, this is what just about everybody does. Now, as I mentioned, I did a book on this a number of years ago, and I thought the method was pretty snazzy, right? Understand, define, refine is great. Design, refine, which was basically awesome until I started reading what everyone else was doing, which was the same thing. So Ideas 42 is on the top. We've got another one there. Dilip Solman has a great book called Last Mile, which is about the behavioral challenges of getting a product being used. The third one is from Irrational Labs. The fourth one is independently developed by a small, I think it's 3-person consultancy in DC. We all came to the same dang answer. You know what that is? Problem solve, right? What we've done is we've built a machine that can identify behavioral obstacles, can take a problem, identify behavioral obstacles, identify potential intervention, develop a product or service that then uses that intervention, and we can measure it in the field. That's the behavioral process in a nutshell. That's what just about everybody in the field is doing. Not too sexy, sorry. But what it means is that there are a lot of good guides. There's this old book I wrote, fine. You can read just about anybody's, and you're gonna get the same thing. You're gonna get that same process. The content is different, but the process is remarkably the same. The more groups I talk to, I see this again and again. And so there's often a conversation when you start talking about the diversity of behavioral teams around the world where someone will ask, yeah, but are they really behavioral scientists? Aren't they just reading nudge, slapping around some words and calling it behavioral science? And at least in this survey, and by the way, I think if you check the numbers, we had over 40% of the known universe answer our survey. And looking at a variety of the characteristics, it's a pretty good representation of that overall master list. So at least among our survey, no, actually they're doing real work. In fact, we gave the list of the cognitive mechanisms and the interventions that people use, and yeah, actually they're using exactly what we talk about. The social interventions are the most common. Those are your social proof, descriptive norms, etc. Pure comparison, stuff like that. There's some good old standard pure economics, right? Just what are the incentives? Are we aligning? Are we helping people benefit from this action? And then a lot of channel factors, reminders, planning prompts. In other words, exactly what you see in the literature, right? These are the key nudges that we've discovered and we talk about. Now, another, to be frank, often derisive comment that people say about the range of teams out there is, well, okay, they're slapping it around, maybe they know how to read a book, but they're not actually testing, they're not actually learning and doing this process of structured humility I talk about. Nope, it's not the case either. In fact, the majority of teams are running randomized control trials, and I'll show you many of them are running them a whole lot better than some academics, okay? There is an amazing base of skill and expertise out there. Now, that's not everybody, right? There's still 30% who aren't. Some of them are doing pre-post, some of them are doing other stats analysis. We had other questions in there. I should say that these, for the rest of the discussion, I'm talking specifically about businesses and nonprofits. So I'm not talking about the academic side and the government side. They have some very different activities. So this is about, as the talk is named, the business of behavioral science and the challenges there, okay? So what do they focus on? We find the single biggest group is external consulting. As you'll see, it's also the largest group of jobs in the field right now. So Ideas 42, for example, the one that George mentioned earlier, is a consulting shop. They go out and they serve clients, government clients, individual clients, et cetera, and apply behavioral science to help them with their problems. Busara is one, right? A lot of the big players are. Next is these teams are often sitting within existing research groups or data science groups, followed by the main areas of application: building products, building communications, designing the UI. What we often hear about is the exciting new field of people analytics. That's there, it's just really, really small, at least in this survey. We may have missed some, right? But at least in our numbers, it's really quite small. And the main behavior change being sought, not surprisingly for private sector companies and for nonprofits, is to use a product. Now here I need to point out a problem in the survey in which we asked people whether they tried to change financial behavior, and then we listed spending first, and that was the top choice. We think that's because they were getting people to spend on their product. It's not like actually helping people save for the future. We also looked over the list and can tell that pretty quickly because we know the folks who are doing investing and saving work out there. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? It's normal. So in that group of, well, buying a product and using a product are caps that remind people to take their medicine. There are fitness trackers that help people, well, stay on a course of exercise. There are diet programs. There are sleep trackers that help people who have chronic problems sleeping use the app more often. So when we say private sector and we say buying and using a product, sometimes that's rather distasteful, and sometimes it's not, right? It is the core activity of business, and we shouldn't expect that someone will simply try to change a behavior that has nothing to do with their own products, right? That's kind of table stakes for working in this field. And we can find lots of examples of some very thin marketing work. There was a site called Which Test One, which unfortunately is now, they were bought out and you can't find anymore. But they had the largest repository of tests that I've ever seen. So at the last time I looked, there were up to like 800 different RCTs, randomized control trials. And these are some of the examples that myself and others had captured from it. Testing how people think about insurance, testing ING. This is the take-up of savings accounts. Tremendous boost in savings account just by changing design. California closets, for a random example. Alpha, all sorts of different groups out there. So private sector, especially for digital products or for digital interactions, there's just a tremendous amount of work going on there. Now, many of these are not officially behavioral, and they wouldn't claim to be. But we can see in their mechanisms and in the techniques they're using the overlap between traditional marketing and a behavioral marketing approach. But again, the use of this in marketing, the use of this in purchase behavior doesn't necessarily mean a bad thing. Let me give the example of Creative Science, where they did a program to help people donate. Right? So they looked at, as many of you know, there's a good body of literature on what encourages somebody to connect with a charity and want to donate, which overall as a society, donation is probably a good thing. And so Creative Science is a consultancy. They took on a client that was looking to increase donations, and they tested, for example, the identifiable victim, right? Seeing the person that you can help, that matters. It's actually their top performing one, versus just talking about the statistics, versus talking about how it's going to help the company, help the organization. And what's notable isn't just that they were looking at donations, which is generally a social good, it's how they did it. So their normal process is this: get an idea, do some mock-ups, right? Start roughing it out, what it might look like in a real product, test that on Mechanical Turk, see if you have enough signal, right? Many academic studies, sadly, still stop there. We're pushing, I know CDR does a lot better, but you'll still see a lot of these just studies that stop at Mechanical Turk. This small consultancy keeps on going, right? They say, okay, now that we have an idea of what has a big signal, let's actually put it in the real product. Not a lab, but let's actually put it on the screen where they're doing donations. Let's do the real life example. Let's do the real life product, the real life interaction. And then let's run a large scale randomized control trial and publish the results. That's awesome. That is what we should aspire to. An iterative, thoughtful approach to building up a study over time and then sharing those results. Tiny little consultancy, right? And so the opportunities are immense here, not only for lots of other little groups to do good, but also I know for many people who they're looking for a job. They're excited about this field and they want to get involved. So let me talk to that. What we see is that many of these teams are quite recent, since 2013. By the way, that 1976, that is Paul Slovic. He was kind enough to reach out and fill out the information. He was really one of the pioneers in the field, so that was very kind of him. But the other ones here, I can't say that there's a clear acceleration, and the reason is, of course, that those in 2013, only the ones that still exist responded. And so you have a survivorship problem here. I think probably as a researcher, I would just say, it looks kind of flat, might be tilted if you squint, but I wouldn't put much into that, right? There's just not enough data here. We see a growth since something happened in 2013, and we've seen a continued growth since then. What we're seeing especially is the growth around the world, right? Nudge Lebanon, Nudge Rio, the tiny groups in France, in Armenia, et cetera. Those are the ones that they're seeing a spreading out. We're seeing a hive of activity in Latin America now, where there really wasn't much of a community, right? That's where we're seeing a lot of the new action. And we can also estimate the total number of jobs in the field. Now, this does involve some rather heroic assumptions, so work with me here. But we did ask people what was the size of their team. You add all of that up, and you fill in a few gaps where you know them, and you get about 3,000 folks. Okay? You adjust for the fact that we got about 40% coverage of the known universe, and that gets you up to about 7,000. Okay? You look particularly at the focus of this talk, which is businesses and nonprofits, and you're about 4,400. Now, for those of us who've been in the field a while, that's a lot. Wow! Do you know how hard it was a few years ago just to find anybody who'd do this? It was crazy. But let me put it in perspective. So I work at Morningstar. We have over 5,000 employees. So Morningstar has more employees than the entire collection of dedicated behavioral science teams around the world. Just to put it in perspective, right? The Action Design Network, which is a nonprofit I mentioned, we have events in, I think, 14 cities around the country now. And we have 16,000 people who have either come to or interested in these events. Nir Eyal, I know if you're familiar with his work, he came out with a book on product psychology, not behavioral science per se, right? But particularly on how you could hook people with your products. Distasteful or not, it shows the tremendous interest in the field of applying psychology to product design. He sold over 300,000 copies, right? The field of marketers, of product designers, of product managers, et cetera. I don't have an exact number, so I put down a lot. But we know that it's well over 1 million just in the US, right? And so the dedicated teams are increasingly diverse and spreading out across the globe. It's just, that's not where the real future growth will be. It's not on those teams. It's not on Busar adding another 10 people. It's rather on new teams starting and new people bringing this into their work. That's where we see it. And so you can find official behavioral science dedicated team jobs out there. If you're curious, these are two of the best sites. BehavioralEconomics.com and People Science have two good boards. I always use SJDM, Society of Judgment Decision Making. That's a great place to post as well. But you'll get, I don't know, 10 a month for the entire field. That's about it. And so let me show you the other route. And I'll give the example of William, who started the first behavioral team in Saudi Arabia. So William was as a partner at Abaub & Co., which is this consulting firm in Saudi Arabia, works with a variety of different clients. She was interested in behavioral science herself. She was a partner in the firm. She has stability in her job and said, you know, I want to learn more. I want to get involved. She took a master's at LSE, and at the same time started to look around for clients who might be interested. She says there was an alignment and between her company supporting her, this client saying, yes, we want to do the first behavioral science project in Saudi, and her master's at LSE. She was able to do a project, demonstrate its worth, show to the rest of her company, hey, this is something valuable. Now she has a 4-person team and growing and continuing to do this work. That's where it looks like the future growth is going to be. If you look, for example, at the survey, we asked how teams started. By and large, it was either A new company specifically started for behavioral science, right? That's usually somebody breaking off from an existing company and saying, I want to be a consultant. But the rest are really somebody inside the company who's interested in this and brings it into their job. The external person saying, you should really have a behavioral science team. Will you hire me? 3%. And I think we know all of those people. It's very rare. It's very rare. Instead, what we see is in marketing, in product, in design, and some in people analytics. It's using the skills you have and bringing in behavioral science and showing what's possible. Or as Matt Wallert from Clover likes to said, it's like you do a really good job for a year. You really show off, you make everyone happy, and then after a year you tear off the mask and say, ha, it was because of behavioral science. Because nobody cares before that, and they shouldn't. What they should care about is, are you helping the customer? Are you helping the business? Are you doing something meaningful as a product manager, a designer, a marketer, et cetera? And so what does it take to start your own team? I think about this as, what are the low-hanging fruit? How can you, like William did, demonstrate value without making a big stink out of it, right? Without trying to convince somebody, hey, let's do this completely new and different thing. No, you should cheat. You should find the easiest thing you can do and then show how cool it was afterwards rather than trying to convince people. And what you really shouldn't do is this. So my first behavioral study at the company of Hello Wallet, is anybody here familiar with this one? Is that a laugh? Nope, okay. I was working with an academic researcher. He was a wonderful guy. And he and I talked about doing a social experiment. We try to have people talk with each other about their finances. It's anonymous, so it's not too creepy, but trying to help each other in this way. And so I spent months trying to convince my CEO, saying this is going to be the next best thing since sliced bread. This is going to be awesome. It was a startup. We pulled resources from the development of our core application, engineer, designer to build this thing. Took a while, took all my capital within the company, right? And we built it and we turned it on and one person used it. And then they stopped. It was really quite sad. And I couldn't do another dang study for a year and a half. I had no credibility, nothing. Because I blew it on something that was hard, that was different, that was strange, and that was risky, which are all the things you don't want to do. If you're starting a team, if you want to get into this, start with things that are other people care about, not just you. That the company will see the benefit, right? The benefit by helping your users, the benefit by helping the company, that you're pretty darn sure that it's going to be successful. In other words, you cheat. You find something that you know is already going to win. You put your money on that and you say, look, it won. Let's do more behavioral science. In other words, you build trust and you build familiarity. You don't try and shock the system, right? And of course, you need quality data, and hopefully it just doesn't take a lot of work. So the opportunity out there for people who want to enter this field, who want to get involved, is tremendous. As consultants, as marketers, as product people, to build products that really help people in their lives, to do something different, to help them close that intention-action gap. But it's not just opportunity that we face. Instead, there are some very significant challenges. Now, some of those challenges are practical. So one of the questions we asked was, what are your challenges? What do you struggle with? And, well, key was measuring the impact of interventions, right? Because it's hard. Now, the teams that we talked to, they were doing RCTs. The median team size is 6 people. There's a few very big ones out there, and there's a very long tail. And they were running about 4 RCTs a year, which is still pretty darn good, right? But it can be difficult to design an experiment, especially if you don't have formal training. Next, we saw that just getting them implemented, right? In other words, when people weren't taking really easy things to do, or it was easy to implement, they found it to be hard, right? So if you don't start with the easy wins, not surprisingly, it can be difficult. Ideas were last on the list. Ideas are cheap. There are lots of great ideas on how to do behavioral studies. Anyone can read. The challenge is finding an environment where the behavioral obstacles aren't so big, where you have the trust, where you have the environment. We have what William had at Balb & Co. Those are the practical challenges, and they are manageable. The far more important challenge are the ethical ones. Who here knows of Detour? Well, you should. You're going to learn about it real soon. whether we like it or not. DETOR is a bipartisan bill in the US Senate that would ban behavioral experiments. There's a reckoning coming because of the abuses in the field. This is our key challenge. So what the bill says is from Senator Warner and Fisher, Republican, Democrat and Republican. It explicitly calls out the prohibiting of behavioral experiments. It calls out the use of behavioral psychology to push people to buy things they don't want and to give up their personal data. And this is a reckoning that we have well earned in the field. There are sadly many, many examples. This is, on the right, you see a study by Norwegian watchdog, which is then picked up throughout the EU, where they studied how tech companies in particular were skirting GDPR, skirting the new privacy law across all of the EU, and using explicitly nudges, hidden defaults, misinformation, in order to push people to give up their information. In other words, to completely circumvent GDPR. In particular, their location information. This has been picked up by many different groups within the EU, and yes, we see this in the US as well. We see this with Uber, where the behavioral science team explicitly looked at how to get people to keep driving, regardless of whether it was safe, regardless of the wishes of the individual. And they were thankfully called out for this. The team was recently disbanded, not because of this, though. Okay, it was shut down a few months ago. And so this was behavioral science. This was not somebody reading a book and saying, I'm a behavioral scientist. No, these are PhD researchers, well-trained and thoughtful people who, in many ways, wanted to do good. We see the Facebook study, where, as many of you know, Facebook, in working with a set of academics, right? It's not all those bad people in the private sector. Working with a set of academics, set up a study where they would manipulate the feeds of individuals to see how it affected their emotions. And as a number of people pointed out online, right, they're making people sad. And for when you're dealing with millions of people, this was hundreds of thousands, sad for many people means depressed and means suicidal. And so people rightfully asked, how many people did the researchers kill? How many people did the researchers kill by pushing drivers to drive beyond their safe limits? We see this actually in many of the gig economy applications. Complaint after complaint online, and thankfully now to regulators, about apps that punish them for taking breaks because that limits the profits of the company. We see this also in small companies. This is not just the big tech platforms. We see this, for example, in ThreadUp. So ThreadUp used a great social proof technique saying, this person has just bought this product. Watch out, this thing is going fast. Only a few left, except they made all of it up. There was no person named Alejandra. There was no person named Abigail. There was no Maria. It was an algorithm specifically designed to manipulate people. These are just a few of the examples. Harry Brignol has a great site called Dark Patterns. It's actually explicitly called out in the DETOR Act, in their writings about it, where he has a site where he both catalogs all the terrible things that companies are doing, and people post their own observations. And you can see just about every company that you've interacted with on there, from little newspapers in your local town to Amazon, and how bloody difficult they make it to cancel your subscriptions. And so when I say there's a reckoning, yeah, we sure have earned it. Now, in the survey we asked, do people know what you're doing? Do they know that you're doing behavioral techniques? Not the specific study, that often can break things, fine. But in general, do they know that you're applying behavioral techniques? And by and large, people said no. The majority said either no one knew or only a few people knew. Now, sometimes that's okay, but that sure is a warning sign. This isn't a small box of groups. This isn't just, hey, there are some bad people at Uber. Actually quite thoughtful. In fact, they worked with some of the leading academics in the field on their optimization strategies. It's not some bad people at Facebook. Okay, maybe I can dig on Facebook. It's not some bad people at each of these companies. It's instead that we are human beings. And just as we study behavioral science of action, we should look to the behavioral science of ethics. There's a great body of work Kwame Appiah summarizes in his book, Experiments in Ethics. Dan Ariely talks about some of his work, the work of his lab. It shows how context-dependent our ethical behavior is, just like everything else. It's like the core lessons of behavioral science overall. Whether we stop to help a stranger matters on what we're thinking about and whether we feel busy. Whether we steal depends on whether we think we're being watched and whether we think it's normal. I steal pencils because it's not stealing. That's just pencils from work. No big deal, right? And so as behavioralists, we can change that context. We can apply behavioral science to ourselves and say, okay, how can we remove the fudge factor, as Dan Ariely talks about it, this ability for us to lie to ourselves that we are still wonderfully great people, even though we're doing this horrible thing, right? We can look at how to set up clear feedback to make social commitments. And we can also look to the design community, where again and again, they've been here long before we have. So this comes from an essay of Milton Glaser of 2002 on the road to hell, on talking about the various gradations of harm that a product can do that a perfectly reasonable designer would be asked to do. And so they've set up standards and saying, this is what it means to do ethical design. So they set a set of commitments. And we can do that as well. It's something actually we use these techniques on my team at Morningstar. But Cass Sunstein, lots of people have talked about, is it ethical to nudge? They've laid parameters on what an ethical nudge is. That ain't the problem. The problem isn't defining what's ethical. It's actually doing it. Our problem is not decision. Our problem is action, is straying from the right. We have an intention-action gap. We have wonderful students coming out of our programs who go to Uber, Facebook, ThreadUp, etc., TaskRabbit, all these companies, and then do really bad things. It's not because they're bad people. It's because they're people. And we need something more. And in particular, we should take off our behavioral science hat and go back to economics and just look at the basic incentives. If someone is paid to drive leads and their livelihood depends on it, they will drive leads. I'm indebted to Kristen Berman, who is a researcher, really stalwart in the field, very ethical person, has written extensively about how to do behavior change for good. She told me this story actually yesterday, which is why I added this slide at the last minute. She told me this story about how she had taken on a contract with a lender. And it was a great company. They were looking to do alternative scoring and help provide loans to people who otherwise couldn't get them. It was great. They set up the contract saying, look, we believe in our methods and we will only get paid if we in fact can drive loans, that we can successfully do this. She said it started to warp her thinking. And she could only think about, oh man, this is a big contract. We need this. We've got to drive these loans. She said she felt she was turned into a predatory lender. An ethical, thoughtful person, I know and have worked with for a number of years, great person, who just like everyone else was human. Okay, she still is human, sorry. But we all get into this. We are context-dependent people. And we shouldn't think that because we're behavioral scientists, because we're well-trained and thoughtful, we will avoid this any more than anybody else. And so let me take a quick look of where we've been. We've looked around at the range of companies and organizations out there, and there has been a tremendous growth. It is exciting, the range of things that people are doing. From new moms to the Basara Center. Just amazing work out there. Helping encourage donations, helping encourage people to take iron, to be able to feed their children well. These are wonderful things. And we find that, well, the field is diverse, the field is large. We've got a pretty good sense. It's not definitive, let me be very clear. We've got a pretty good sense of who's out there now. We see the diversity in countries. We see that we've basically built a machine, a pattern of how to do behavioral science in the private sector and in nonprofits. Philip Soman talks about it, I talk about it, lots of people have this method and share it. We see that by and large in the private sector it is exactly what you would expect. The usage and the purchasing of products. And that itself is a neutral thing. There are so many great products out there when somebody wants it and they want help to do something. An exercise machine is something you buy and you use, right? It helps you exercise. That's great. Now, there are lots of ways to enter this field, but usually it's by already being in a company and saying, I want to add this in, and then building trust and taking the low-hanging fruit over time. It's not screaming off the hilltops, I am a behavioral scientist, hire me, which we do have some openings on the field. There are a few of them. But that's just not where most of it's happening right now. It's still very, very small. But we have to remember as we go out to do good, how human we are. This is our main challenge. Now, the Detour Act in particular, it's currently worded to only apply to a certain segment of companies. And it may not pass in this Congress, fine. But that reckoning is coming. And we have to get ahead of it as behavioral scientists, as people thinking about how context affects our behavior and how we can do good and shape our environment to support what we want to do. And with that, I want to thank you all. I appreciate, be very happy to, thank you.
All
Very
right.
happy to answer your questions.
So
yeah.
there are some
And I know
mics
we have
going
some mics.
around, I think, right?
Great.
Look at these people.
And I also went about a minute over, so if there are additional questions after, I'm happy to stay. Yeah.
On your slide where you broke down which industry is using it, to have consumers purchase their products, where does the field of advertising, what category did that fit in?
Unfortunately, we don't have it coded to which ones are advertisers right now. But if you'd like to go over a list of 473 companies and look through those with me, I'd love to. So we just don't have that coded right now. Yeah, it wasn't one of the questions. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Narayani Gupta. I'm a second-year student at Booth. Thank you for your time today. I'm wondering what sort of studies does Morningstar do specifically? So what does your team do?
Sure. So I wanted to talk about the field and help people overall, but yes, of course, I run a team and we're hiring. And so we study behavioral science. We study in particular the obstacles people face in using their money, investing. So we study, for example, how people compare themselves to others, and even the wealthiest always look to those who are slightly wealthier and feel bad about what they're doing, right? Feel bad about their lives and know what we can do about that. We study, for example, how you display fees to help people pay more attention. We actually came out with a study at the same time as the FCA, both looking at the same issues. We study how people set goals, how they think about their goals, and how that can keep them on track when they're buffeted by emotional whirlwinds in their lives. So those are some of the studies we run. So we do this for both academic publication and industry publication. We try to spread the lessons wide, and we also build product. So we actually have a marketing group, we have a product group. We've just hired a designer. So we're doing each of those areas that I talked about, and we have a little bit of HR work we do. Yes, whoever wants to call, it's fine. Yeah. And we're hiring.
I get the impression from your talk that most of the research and application of these techniques have to do with focusing on individual consumer interventions, behavioral interventions. And my question is, I'm wondering if you might be able to reference any studies or materials that have to do with organizational behavior. So people in groups, I'm talking about, I mean, the problem I'm thinking about is a group of clients that you want to adopt a new software that has business processes and they need to learn new behaviors and so on. A real common problem.
Sure. So two answers to that. Yes, I was focusing particularly on private sector nonprofits. They're often doing very similar activities. Societal level work, policy level work. There are quite a lot of groups that do that. They're just in the government sector and academic, and that's another part of the report. We just didn't get into that here. And when you talk particularly about group dynamics, there's a little bit, but I really haven't seen much. You see, the frontiers of the work right now, at least in the academic community and now increasingly in the private sector, is going from individual nudges or changes in the environment, however you like to call it, to long-term change and to broader dynamics. What is the net effect of this on a person's life? And both of those are really unexplored frontiers. So Wendy Wood is one of the only people doing long-term work, for example. She's one of the prime researchers in the field of habits. Just a wonderful person. Yeah.
What are the KPIs or incentives for your team and for the other behavioral science teams?
Yeah, so we do, as it were, eat our own dog food. So our KPIs are, we have 4 different groups. So, and each one has its own specific KPIs. In terms of the core research group, it is downloads. And so there is a natural incentive towards sensationalism there, just to be frank, right? Media coverage, and leads. So people who you have an interesting conversation that's not about a product. So I originally pitched the team as a content marketing team. We are the content and content marketing, right? So to have a conversation with people in a way that's not buy my product, buy my product. Other parts of the team, so in the product team, it's did you build a product and did it work, right? Did it actually help the user? Now Morningstar is a very unusual place. We are a mission-driven company, and from the CEO down, they take it seriously. And so our mission is investor success. Are we helping people succeed at their financial goals? And so that's part of our metrics, right? But that is unusual, right? And so we benefit from that structural choice. I am no more ethical than anybody else, but we've set up an environment that I think we've done some pretty good work. So let me get somebody over on this side. So, did that answer your question? Okay, cool. Yeah.
In light of the dangers that legislation on the horizon is possibly posing to the industry, what are you doing on an offensive nature to address those, say perhaps
Sure.
Educational matters to put a better shine on behavioral science?
Sure. So
To
I
the
don't
public, not that I believe it needs
no,
one.
no. I don't actually think the danger is detour at all. I think the danger is what has prompted it. No, it is we have done wrong. That's the danger. We allow our community to do things that are unethical. That's the problem. And so, well, honestly, this is the first time that I'm speaking about this. I'm including a big section of my book about this. And I want to help promote ethical behavioral science. Because, yes, we will be regulated out of existence if we don't get ahead of this. Not just by publicity, but by doing good work. So that's kind of how I see it. And it's and I don't know, to be frank, what are the concrete actions? What are the things that we can do? This is very new to me. The bill is quite new. I actually learned about it just recently. And so I think it's a question for our community. What can we come together at? So I know that's not a satisfying answer, but it's an honest one. Yeah. Yeah. I don't know. I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah, there was a question here.
So just piggybacking off of that, right, and understanding behavioral science, but also understanding from a business perspective that, you know, whether it's Facebook, whether it's Uber, but to really create profit, right? And so when I even think about really trying to get, and maybe you can just maybe speak to this, because I think ethics is inside, outside, top, bottom, I think, like, and I think about primarily Wells Fargo.
Oh, yeah.
You know, and
That, they have a behavioral science team, by the way.
Yeah, right.
They're hiring right now.
And it's amazing. Whereas an employee is trying to drive profits, but doing it in such an unethical way, and then they're wedged in between. So maybe, you know, I really don't know, but I think that ethics, in any capacity, whether it's from a behavioral science perspective, just from a human moral perspective, you know, kind of gets collapsed. So maybe, I don't know if you have thoughts about how to uncollapse that when it's really it's being driven from the top to drive profit. So no, I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
So first, I think fundamentally driving profits is not a bad thing, right? So, I mean, my team is not perfect, but for example, we drive leads that bring in revenue, and we calculate the revenue we're driving for the company, right? But we try to do it in a way that is, for example, engaging system 2, engaging how people think, right? Rather than defaulting people. And the products, right? The products sell, they pay our salaries. The challenge is, as you said, when it is structural to the organization. And there you look. When you're looking at a job, when you're looking at an opportunity, do you say, okay, what are the incentives? How are you paid? How are you incentivized? And that's the time to take an ethical stand. Not the person inside saying, no, I won't do this. Because we will lie to ourselves over time. That's the challenge. It's when you're looking and saying, okay, rationally, I'm about to make a choice. What are the incentives? What's the incentive structure? And how would I assume this company is going to act because of that? Right. And yes, to call out when there are abuses. But the best chances you have is when you're not part of that already. Does that help? Yeah. I think there was one here. Yes.
Do you think there's any ethical responsibility to the individual being influenced, and not just the influencer?
Yes, of course. I mean, we have free choice.
So where's the line between the two then?
This has often been a question. Well, aren't there lots of gray areas? And I say, yeah, absolutely. Let's try to do some things that are clearly good first, and then I think we can get into fine gradations. I think we have situations that are clearly wrong. Let's try and stop those rather than. I think there's a tendency in the field to try and argue with each other and to try and make space for gray and, well, this version, that version. I'd say let's attack the big obvious problems first, right? And let's try to do good work. There obviously are. There's a line. We may disagree on it, and I can respect your choice. So, but I try to get to where basically we can all agree that pushing people to drive when it's not safe is a bad thing. Punishing them is a bad thing. So those are the types of situations I look to first and foremost. Yeah.
I wanted to talk about your ethical mission that you mentioned about investor success and how that's becoming more difficult due to some trends in society that we probably never intended. So if we look at the Uber IPO this year, there were numerous people that spoke out against that before it happened, and 20 years ago it probably never would have priced. You know, how did that happen? Where did the behavioral science go wrong? How did so many people miss that? How did it even get that far there? Do we need to have better regulation of private investments the way we do with the SEC before they even get there to prevent these problems? And then lastly, on top of the icing on the cake there, in a world where in a world where now 50% of the investments in the market are in passive investment vehicles. Well, we're dumping paychecks into the overvalued 20 stocks in the S&P 500 automatically every 2 weeks with no mechanism to stop that. Where do you see these things ending, and what can Morningstar do to be a positive force in creating change around those emerging crises?
I think that might be a good discussion for a drink after. Let's keep it at that. So, and we do actually focus on private markets as well. So we look at both sides. Yes.
I read your book for this presentation, so I want to recommend it to people in the room who haven't seen it. It's pretty good.
And it's old, so, but there's new one coming.
And then I also read some of B.J. Fogg's stuff because he wrote your preface, and that was also interesting. The one problem I had with the book and with Fogg is that everything reminded me of operant conditioning. And I kept asking myself, at what point does Steve talk about thinking, cognition, understanding why you're doing something instead of just doing something?
Yeah. So I think if you dig into both the history and the practice of behavioral science, they're similarly named and quite different in their theoretical foundations. So the cognitive science revolution was a counter to Skinnerian operant, well, in this case, behavioralism, right? Was a counter to that in saying the behavioralists of that time, right? Behaviorist versus behavioralist, very similar name, very different foundation, unfortunately. Skinner et al. Said, it doesn't matter what goes on in the mind. We can simply train people based on the external environment, right? And the cognitive revolution said, no, it really matters the mechanisms of the mind and what's going on there. And I think if you dig into the literature a little bit more, I think you'll find that cognitive history is core to behavioral science, to applied behavioral science. There are a few who come from more of an operant conditioning perspective, but it's really about what are the mechanisms of the mind? How does our psychology work? What are the shortcuts that our minds use in order to avoid the fundamental limitations of our attention, of our memory, of our willpower, et cetera? So I think it's, I think if you dig in, you'll find it's actually quite different. So, and I think it's a much more humanizing perspective. Yes? Sure, one more. Make it good. Oh, the mic's coming, just so other people can hear. I can hear you the way.
I'm kind of a little bit surprised at the level of ethics discussion in behavioral research. I mean, technically, everything that we have ever developed as a society and species could be used for a good thing or a bad thing.
Yeah.
Let's just use a hammer, for example, and I'll let it your imagination run wild. But basically, why is this right now such a hot focus to a point of legislation?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. I think there is no simple answer. How I see it, or at least have I observed it personally, which is not a research study, is there's something distinctly personal about people thinking of your psychology and thinking how that affects your behavior, thinking about changing it intentionally. Now, we are a social species. To affect change is to affect behavior change. They are usually coterminous, but we don't talk about it that way, right? And so what behavioral science has done is it's made explicit what has been implicit in the design community and the product community for so long. We're talking explicitly about behavior change. We're talking explicitly about, well, sadly, some people say, make someone do something. And yeah, that raises hackles. So I think there's something even uniquely creepy about saying there's a behavioral experiment, the word experiment is loaded, right, that changed people's emotions. When of course, we of course do that to each other all the time, intentionally and unintentionally. And so I think of it as, yes, there is a perhaps undue focus on the ethics of behavioral science, where there isn't that, that same focus on other communities that are doing very similar things. And I say, great, let's use this opportunity to not stay in the muddled middle, right, to do something better. Does that speak to your question? Cool, thank you.
On that note, let's thank Steve. I learned a lot. I'm sure all of you did. Amazing stuff. Thank you so much,
Great.
Steve.